So let's start off this lesson by taking a look at what is known as the Sidney Lanier Bridge in Brunswick, Georgia. Sidney Lanier Bridge was a massive undertaking which began in 1997, where a $65 million contract was awarded to a company to complete its construction. So what was the purpose of constructing the Sidney Lanier Bridge? We can look to the side of this bridge and actually see the old bridge. What was wrong with the old bridge? According to a spokesperson for the Georgia Department of Transportation, at the time of the bid, the replacement of this bridge and the deepening of the channel would provide for navigation clearance necessary to keep the Port of Brunswick competitive into the 21st century. It was estimated at the time that the sales revenue would increase by $464 million annually. And it was also estimated that 1,100 jobs would be created by the year 2010. An article published in 2002 heralded the finishing of the Sidney Lanier Bridge. The point of this introduction is to exemplify the arduous task of constructing such a monumental achievement. These things don't happen overnight. Ultimately, it took many hours, many laborers, important capital, and incredible engineering to produce such an amazing structure. Again, what was the point in this incredible investment in a bridge that cost $65 million to produce? The answer is that it would have long-term implications for the type of business that this port could handle. When we look at a nation's ability to produce, we can look to examples such as the Sidney Lanier Bridge to identify the resources that we currently employ in order to increase production. So the bridge allows bigger ships and more containers in order to give us the ability to reach a point of production that we were previously unable to attain. Another interesting note about the Sidney Lanier Bridge is that, for all intents and purposes, it is a permanent structure. When I moved to this area 11 years ago, one of the first memories I have is driving over this bridge to enter the city of Brunswick. And I would imagine that 11 years from now or 20 years from now, I will still be able to drive over this same exact bridge to enter Brunswick. So this bridge has long-term implications to the economic viability of the area of Glenn County. Now here's a closer look at the port. Our area is a major hub for imported new automobiles. As you can see in this picture, this area brings in $84 billion in production, creating approximately 369,000 full-time and part-time jobs. So another question would be, what would give our port an ability to increase the production of imported automobiles? As we discussed in a previous video, the capacity to produce comes from a nation's land, that is natural resources, workers, or what we refer to as labor, capital, or essentially the machinery, as we can see in this picture, this river, harbor, and this port. You can also see in this image the capital goods necessary to produce. Of course, starting with the container ships. So what would give us the capacity to increase the number of automobiles imported? In the previous slide, you saw an image of the Sidney Lanier Bridge and the construction of the Sidney Lanier Bridge. Also, the noted deepening of the channel. So let's use an economic model that we studied in class referred to as the production possibility frontier to answer the question, what might allow us to get beyond our current frontier and outside the curve? Noted at the bottom of the slide are some potential increased resources that might allow us to get beyond our existing curve. For instance, a larger bridge and dredging the port allow bigger and better boats to access the area, as well as more usable land to actually store the automobiles. When we look around the United States, we see many examples of businesses that have invested in capital to increase their capacity to produce and thus, as a business, grow. Amazon is a massive company. Amazon uses many resources to bring to the market the service and the goods that they produce. As you can see in this slide, you have what are called fulfillment centers. The fulfillment centers' function is to house products and act as a base to essentially ship to many parts of the country the goods and services in demand. At the time of this video, these red dots represented different fulfillment centers throughout the country. So how does Amazon get beyond their current curve? The answer is build more fulfillment centers. With more fulfillment centers, you need more workers. More laborers equals greater output. Greater output pushes Amazon beyond their current PPF. So more fulfillment centers, more capital, more laborers. This would push Amazon beyond their current curve and allow them to produce at a previously unattainable point. So when we look at our country as a whole, what is our nation's total production? At the time of this video, which is 2018, the U.S. total gross domestic product was right around $18 trillion. So how can our nation experience growth? The answer is we need to invest in the factors of production. We need more land. We need more labor. We need more capital. We need more resources. Additions to these resources enable us to get beyond a point of previous production. Another economic model, which is a bit more in depth, is what's known as the long-run aggregate supply and demand model. This economic model offers us the ability to illustrate the conditions in the economy at any given time when the economy is either in long-run equilibrium or some disequilibrium state. So let's go ahead and take a look at the long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. You might notice that right away the y and the x-axis are similar to the basic aggregate supply and demand model we discussed in a previous video. So let's go ahead and illustrate our model in what we call long-run equilibrium. The first curve we look at is the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Remember that the term aggregate refers to the sum of all, in this case, demand. You also have an aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve represents the total short-run ability to produce goods and services based on the factors of production. In addition to the aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply, you also have what's called a long-run aggregate supply curve. Now notice at this point of long-run equilibrium, we have a desirable level of unemployment, or what we would call full employment, of about 5 to 6% unemployment. Additionally, we have an acceptable level of inflation of around 2 to 3%. So when the economy is in long-run equilibrium, we are producing with a fully employed economy of around 2 to 3% inflation. In our next video, we'll talk a little more about this model and how it allows us to illustrate various conditions in the overall economy.